Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien, and it is an absolutely gorgeous Tuesday here in Appalachia. I trust that it is, if you are on the East Coast, I trust that it is beautiful where you are as well, and probably other parts of the country as well. It is absolutely beautiful because everybody's talking about what's coming, but right now, you got to live for the moment, and our moment is absolutely gorgeous here. We're in the 70s, the sun is shining, the sky is blue, and I'm here on a Tuesday afternoon with you here at the Virtual Center. What more could anyone ask for? Thank you. Thank you for your trust in us and your trust in the Head On Radio Network. I look forward to 90 minutes together today as we continue looking at a couple of what I think are some of the most relevant and significant Federalist papers of all. I invite you to participate actively in our program by picking up the phone and giving us a call. We would love to hear from you. I know that our listeners would love to hear from you as well. So your ideas, your questions, your concerns, your what-ifs, we would love to hear them. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. I promise that I will respond, and hopefully in kind. If you send me a substantive email, I feel duty-bound to try to respond to you substantively as well. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I was telling, just before we came on the air, I was telling Bob Kincaid, I'm going to share a little secret with you, but I have concocted a gizmo here in the studio where I broadcast the program from. I got an old stool that was stored in our attic, and I put it on the desk so that my laptop, my computer is eye level, almost eye level. I've decided that I'm doing too much sitting. And so I've been thinking for several days about ways that I might be able to work on the computer and to do the program standing up. So this weekend I brought this bench down from the attic and I put the laptop on it. I've been working on it, but yesterday was the first program that I did the entire 2-hour program on my feet. And I was telling Bob that at the end of the program I was pooped. I must have walked 10 miles, walking in circles, obviously, and pacing and things. But Bob made a comment that the energy level seemed to change. It seemed to be a little bit higher, so that's good. But I've kind of concluded that I really need to do a little bit less sitting at the computer, a little bit more moving around and standing up. It's just not good for the back and all of those things. So if I really get animated, I add the mileage, if it were, as it were. So anyway, I did that today, and I'm doing it. It was interesting. I was out walking my dog this morning, and I usually walk her at least a mile early in the morning. Yesterday, about 2 miles. This morning, about a mile. But this morning, I had the added thing, and I said, well, I know I'm going to walk another 2 miles during the program today. So that kind of made me feel a little bit better coming home after only a mile rather than 2 miles this morning. It is a pleasure to be with you, and thank you again for your trust in us and in the Head On Radio Network, and your willingness to give us a portion of your valuable time for our program. You will recall that yesterday we began looking at just a quick review of yesterday's program. That's the advantage of Tuesday and Wednesday programs here at the Virtual Center. The reviews can be much shorter because we're only talking 24 hours earlier. On Mondays, however, we're talking 5 days earlier, so consequently the reviews, if it's going to be any kind of a continuation at all, the reviews need to be a little bit more lengthy and a little bit more substantive. But yesterday's program, you will recall, we spent the first hour of our program on Patrick Henry's speech from the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788, in which Patrick Henry pretty much laid it out as to what his major concerns or what his major issues were with the Constitution of the United States and why he thought it would be a mistake for Americans to ratify this convention in the form in which it was sent out for ratification. And Patrick Henry made some very specific references to defenses of the Constitution that were obviously written by his fellow member of the Virginia delegation, James Madison. The one thing you will find by looking at the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788 is that the convention really comes down to a contest between Patrick Henry and James Madison. James Madison defending the work of the Constitutional Convention, and Patrick Henry employing his incredibly broad oratorical skills in attacking it. And basically, as part of the attack in the particular speech that we looked at yesterday, Patrick Henry made specific references to Madison's footwork, if you will, in trying to argue that the Constitution is all things to all people. It's Republican, in some ways it's national, in some ways it's Federalist, federal, because in certain places it relies directly on the people. In other places it indirectly relies on the people. And one of the things we looked at in Madison's Federalist number 39 was the very clever way, and I use clever appropriately here, the very clever way that Madison was able to define Republican government. And his definition pretty much depended upon consent of the governed from the people. And he makes the point, not just a portion of the people, but all of the people. The body of citizens is the way Madison put it. But what he says is that that input, that consent from the people, can either be direct or indirect. And what that does is enable Madison to claim that the people were involved in the selection of officers under the Constitution in which they were only indirectly involved, specifically choosing members of the United States Senate. Under the Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures. But Madison's point is that since the state senators were elected by the people of that state, therefore, when the senators of that state participate in the selection of the two United States senators, the people are indirectly involved. In other words, they're involved even if indirectly. And the same goes for the selection of the president under the Constitution. As we know, the president of the United States is not elected directly by the people. The president is chosen by the Electoral College. On election night, for example, our major networks, while they give us totals on the total vote, what they are primarily concerned about are electoral votes. Because each state gets a certain number of electoral votes based on the number of representatives they have in Congress, plus the two senators. So, for example, here in West Virginia, we have 3 congressional districts. And, as every other state, we have 2 senators. So that means that West Virginia has 5 electoral votes. And of course, what that also means in our campaigns, in our presidential campaigns during in election years, is that because West Virginia only has 5 electoral votes, it usually doesn't get a whole lot of attention during the campaign itself, unless the election is anticipated to be extremely close. Madison even makes the point in Federalist 39 that the people are indirectly involved in the selection of Supreme Court justices, even though they are appointed by the president for life. And Madison admits that the people's involvement in the selection of justices, he says, is remote at best, extremely remote. But it's there because the people participate in the selection of the president through the Electoral College, and the president in turn appoints members of the Supreme Court for life. So that gives Madison the opportunity to claim that even though remotely the people are involved in the selection of the president, therefore the charge of Patrick Henry that this new government is a national government, is a consolidated national government, is challenged by Madison by doing some very, very questionable, I would argue, questionable logic and questionable rhetorical footwork, as it were. When we stopped yesterday, when we concluded our program yesterday in Federalist number 39, we had looked at what I think is a very specious argument by Madison, comparing the Constitution of the United States to the constitutions of many of the states, and suggesting that because the Constitution is so cognizant of the role of the states in governance, therefore it is consistent with, rather than contradictory to, the charge and the intent of the convention, and more importantly, the charge of the states who sent delegates to that convention. And Madison makes the point that the Senate of the United States is elected for 6 years. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. The President serves for a period of 4 years. And the Supreme Court is, of course, appointed by the President for life, with the advice and consent of the Senate. So there again, the people are involved in the selection of of court justices, albeit only from a remote position. In fact, Madison's exact words are, "The choice of Supreme Court justices, though a remote choice, is a choice of the people themselves." And Madison even argues that because the Constitution of the United States includes an impeachment clause for the president and for members of the court, it actually gives the people more input and more control over the government under the Constitution than many state constitutions have. Madison makes the point that state constitutions do not include impeachment provisions. Once your officers are in there, they're in there until the next election. Of course, the fact of the matter is, under the Articles of Confederation, legislatures for the most part were elected every year. They were elected annually. So the people had regular access, if you will, to throwing out the bums, so to speak. But the Constitution of the United States, Madison is very proud to say, includes an impeachment provision for the chief magistrate. So this is exactly where we stopped in our treatment of Federalist 39 yesterday. with this conclusion. Madison makes the conclusion at the end of his reasoning here and says, could any further proof be required of the Republican complexion of the system? In other words, because the people are involved in so many different places, how can anybody question the fact that it's Republican, that we have adhered to the principles of Republican government in this Constitution? So again, he says, could any further proof be required of the Republican complexion of the system? The most decisive one might be found in its absolute prohibition of titles of nobility, both under the federal and state governments, and in its express guarantee of the Republican form to each of the latter. What Madison is referring to here is Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States, in which the Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government to every state. That's what Madison means when he says that the Constitution includes an express guarantee of the Republican form to each of the latter, to each of the states. You will recall, however, because we've been there before here on the Virtual Center, that in the 1840s, the issue of Republican government came before the Supreme Court in a case that began in Rhode Island. And there were two competing groups claiming election in the state of Rhode Island. And the case came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was asked to decide which of the two competing claimants to election in Rhode Island was legitimate. And the basis for the case was that the Constitution of the United States promised a Republican form of government to the states. Therefore, the litigants, the claimants, were making the case to the Supreme Court that because of the way they won the election fair and square, they ought to be the ones that are given the nod by the Supreme Court, because the court has a response. The Constitution guarantees Republican government to the states. And if you remember, the Supreme Court under Justice Roger B. Taney backed off making a decision in this case and said that the ingredients of a Republican government were political matters, not judicial ones. And therefore, it was up to Congress and up to the state legislatures to define the ingredients of Republican government, not the court. So in a sense, what the court was effectively doing is refusing to put any teeth into the promise of the Constitution to guarantee Republican government to the states. When it came time to basically acknowledge that and identify exactly what that meant, the court backed off. So I think it's really important here that when you look at Madison in Federalist number 39, he's praising the Constitution for its guarantee of the Republican form to each state. But at the same time, he's not giving any substance to what the Republican form really means. In reality, what he has done in Federalist number 39 is that he has focused on the issue of form. And he has said, as long as government's power is derived from the whole body of the people, directly or indirectly, it constitutes Republican government. That's the form. So as long as you can link the participation of citizens into the political process, the label of Republican is legitimate. I think that's very significant. I mentioned this yesterday, but it's so important, I think it's worthwhile mentioning again today. What makes this significant, at least to me, is that what Madison has done here, I believe, and this is obviously interpretation on my part, what I believe Madison has done here is to effectively gut the essence of what Republican government was believed to be all about at the time of the founding and at the time of the framing of the Constitution of the United States. Montesquieu had argued, and most of the founders bought into the idea, that in establishing Republican government, they were buying into the ideal form of Republican government described by Montesquieu as being a government which was small in area, which guaranteed that there was a constant and a regular relationship, if you will, between elected representatives and the citizens that they represented. By having a small area and constant communication back and forth between government, between elected representatives and the citizens who elected them, you were able, Montesquieu argued, to guarantee Republican government because the representatives knew their constituents, they knew the needs and wants of their constituents, and they could better make decisions in the public interest. Before they could make decisions in the public interest, they had to know what the public interest was. And that required regular, constant communication. And consequently, government's area of representation had to be small enough to support regular interaction and regular communication. That was the substance of republicanism. It was the model for the Articles of Confederation. By putting power, sovereignty on the state level, the belief of the founders was that the states were small enough. Of course, Madison and Hamilton both argue that it doesn't work because the states, many of the states are so large. But at least in theory, the argument was that by putting power as close as possible to the people, by locating on the state level rather than on the national level, you guaranteed that Republican government could work. More importantly, what you made possible was democratic government, representative democracy. Because since there was a constant communication between the voters and the elected representatives, it was possible for the voters, for the constituents, to get together and instruct their representatives on how to vote on particular issues, which meant that the power of decision-making was in the hands of the voters. By enlarging the political districts, if you will, you made it impossible for the representative to know the needs and wants of his own constituency. And the result was that you had so many competing interests for the ear of the representative that in effect the representative became the independent decision maker rather than the follower of instructions from constituents. And this, I would suggest to you, is the substance, is the very heart of Republican government as defined and described by Montesquieu and as adopted and adhered to by the founders. What Madison is doing here in redefining republicanism by putting the emphasis on the form rather than the substance of Republican government, he is effectively claiming adherence to Republican government, but in reality, the form of Republican government that he describes ultimately really becomes all there is to republicanism. It's all form and no substance. As long as the people participate, you can legitimately claim, according to Madison, that government is Republican. That you have a Republican form of government. I think this is an incredibly important piece of literature. I think it's one of the most important Federalist papers. But let me make a claim, and we're right on the edge of the top of the hour here. We're going to take on Tuesdays we don't take a very long break because we only have 1/2 hour before the top of the first hour and into the second hour, and then we'll have our final hour. So we'll take a short break. But the major point that I would like to make here is, well, actually, I lost my train of thought there. I tell you the truth, when I mentioned the fact that we were going to have a break, I guess I got all excited and I lost my train of thought. But anyway, I think, I know what I was going to say. I believe that this particular Federalist paper and 40, the one that follows it, are incredibly important Federalist papers, but they don't get the attention that Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 and Federalist 78 on the power of the courts, written by Hamilton, and some of the others. They don't get the attention that those get. I'd like to speculate on why I think that's true. I hope I've been able to demonstrate just by looking at the first half. We haven't even completed Federalist number 39 yet. But I feel that already we've established the importance of this particular Federalist paper in the way it deals with republicanism and the way Madison defines republicanism. But the one thing we have to conclude is that this is pretty darn confusing. It's pretty philosophical. It's deep stuff. And I am inclined to believe, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I'm inclined to believe that one of the reasons that this particular Federalist paper doesn't get a whole lot of attention, or at least as much attention as it ought to get, is because it's difficult to understand. Madison is difficult to understand. And part of the reason is because he's not trying to be understandable. He's trying to be politically shrewd. What he has done politically is redefine one of the most important characteristics of the nature of this republic, which is the contents, the substance of Republican government. And he has endorsed with the Constitution of the United States, he is endorsing a view of republicanism that totally changes who has power and who doesn't. But he can't say that. That's what the critics, the Patrick Henrys and the Richard Henry Lees and the other Elbridge Gerrys and the other leading anti-federalists, that's what they are claiming, is that this Constitution creates a consolidated national government and it makes a major change in the governance of the nation in terms of who has power and who doesn't. And what Madison is choosing to do is deflect those criticisms into areas which he himself is taking on and arguing away, arguing into oblivion. And he's doing it very successfully. The reason that this particular Federalist paper is difficult to understand is because it constitutes, in my view, a little bit of rhetorical voodoo. I think it's very important that he does it. I think it's very important to know that it's there, and I think it speaks to the significance of this paper. The fact that Madison in number 39 identifies the issue of Republican government as the most poignant, most important, most significant criticism of the new Constitution suggests that exactly how important this paper is. This is the first issue he chooses to take on from the critics, which means it's one of the most important. Therefore, the Federalist paper that takes it on, which is number 39, in Madison's mind at least, is one of the most important papers. The fact that we haven't appreciated that, I think, speaks to the depth and the level of confusion that Madison intentionally creates within this document. In the back of my mind, I have the Otto letter from the Annapolis Convention in 1786, in which Otto reports to France, to Vergennes, that there's an awful lot of duplicity going on in American politics over this new constitutional convention that's been called. The average common people are being told one thing, and as Patrick Henry says, they're being frightened into changing the structure of national government. And on the other hand, the arguments are being made in ways which the few can understand, the rich and well-born, but the vast majority of the people could never figure out. And ever since then, we've tended to blame this on the inability of the American people to read and understand, to comprehend what they read. In other words, we've blamed the lack of understanding on the people. I think what we've pretty well concluded here is that the reason for the lack of understanding and the confusion does not rest with the people. It rests with those making the case for ratification of the Constitution. To be blunt about it, the Federalists are being a little bit less than honest here. But again, it's because they believe that the ends justify the means. And we'll see more of that, because in Federalist number 40, Madison makes the case that the ends justify the means. And whatever you need to do, it's the end product that is the most important. We're at 5 minutes after the hour. Why don't we pause just for a minute or two and take a quick break and give everybody a chance to go get a cup of coffee or a Coke or something like that, and then we'll resume with our full second hour here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you for being with us. Stay with us. We'll be right back in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour on this Tuesday edition. It's the last day of September, the 30th day of September in the year 2014. It is 9 minutes past the hour, 9 minutes past 2 in the Eastern time zone. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you've been with us for the first portion of our program, we spent most of the first half hour in today's abbreviated program reviewing some of the issues that we addressed yesterday. We are into Federalist number 39. If you would like to bring up Federalist number 39 on your computer and kind of read along as we go, that would be a good idea, I think. It would be good to be looking at the words while you're hearing some of the interpretation, because, you know, it definitely could happen. Many of the things that I'm saying are obviously my interpretation of what I'm reading. And one of the things that makes the world go around, as it were, is that everybody's interpretation of the same thing is not the same. So I would love to hear from you if you have questions or concerns, or if you think that that there are things that are important that are not being mentioned or discussed or given their due in our discussion. I would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. We are well into Federalist number 39. It is a Federalist paper that I believe, and that's the reason I'm giving it the attention that we are here at the Virtual Center, I believe is one of the most important. And very quickly, just as this is in part review of our first hour as well. The reason that I think it's important is because in number 39, Madison announces at the very beginning that the first 38 papers were about the content of the Constitution. But beginning with 39, Publius is going to go into the entire document and what it means and how it is intended to work and why those who support it believe that it will work. So Madison believes that this number 39 is important because it involves a shift in focus from the first 38 Federalist papers. And the very first issue he takes on in number 39 is the issue of republicanism, whether in fact the framers of the Constitution have adhered to America's commitment to the principles of republicanism. And what Madison has done is redefine republicanism such a way that makes the Constitution consistent with it. But the issue that I've been focusing on is whether, in fact, that is totally on the up and up. Because in the process of redefining republicanism to make the Constitution fit this new interpretation, this new definition, what you effectively do is reduce republicanism from its substance to its form. And you basically are suggesting that if the general citizenry can participate in the selection of those who will fill the offices of government, then you have Republican government. If you think about it, under the Iron Curtain, under communism in the 20th century, citizens of communist-dominated nations could vote. The question, of course, is what did they have to vote for? What were their options? And we used to criticize the lack of substance. But under Madison's definition of form, the people were involved. At least in form, they were involved. So could one argue that the Soviet Union was consistent with Madison's definition of Republican government? If you think back to it, it was the United Soviet Socialist Republics. So in a sense, republicanism becomes so fashionable and so popular worldwide that everybody finds a way to fit their particular political system into it. I think that's significant. But the most significant thing is that this is the first issue that Madison addresses once he gets into the real meaning of the Constitution, which says to me that concerns about republicanism, at least in Madison's mind, is one of the major criticisms of the Constitution that he has to take on right away. That's why I think this paper is so important. But there's more. Madison is quoting the adversaries of the proposed Constitution when he says, "But it was not sufficient for the convention to adhere to the Republican form. They ought with equal care to have preserved the federal form, which regards the Union as a confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states." This is Madison's phraseology. Madison's phrasing the criticism of Patrick Henry and others that the Constitution violates not only the Republican form of government, but federalism, the federal form, which places sovereignty in the states. And the major criticism is that the new Constitution creates a national government which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states rather than a confederacy of sovereign states. The criticism is that there's been a shift, total shift in power from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution when looking at specifically the power of the states. Madison says, it is asked by the critics, by what authority this bold and radical innovation was undertaken. The handle which has been made of this objection requires that it should be examined with some precision. So Madison is taking on the second major criticism of the Constitution of the United States, namely that it violates the form of confederacy that existed under the Articles of Confederation, which is a firm league of friendship among solid sovereign states, and changes the nature of the Union into a national government which consolidates the states under it. Obviously, this is a second major criticism being written about and talked about by the anti-federalist critics. So Madison lays out this challenge as follows. He says, without inquiring into the accuracy of the distinction on which the objection is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force. First, to ascertain the real character of the government in question. Second, to inquire how far the convention were authorized to propose such a government. And third, how far the duty they owed to their country could supply any defect of regular authority. So Madison is dividing the issue of the change in government from a federal form to a national form into three parts. Namely, first, to determine the real character of the government. In other words, to what extent is it a national government, as they claim. And second, to inquire into whether the convention was even authorized to propose this kind of a change. And third, how far the duty that they owed to their country could supply or make up for any defect in their authority. In other words, if they did overstep their authority even a little bit, then does the danger that the nation finds itself in justify overstepping its legitimate bounds, even if it's only a little? So Madison's going to take on each of these three concerns. The first one, in order to ascertain the real character of the government, he says, It may be considered in relation to the foundation on which it is to be established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of those powers, to the extent of them, and to the authority by which future changes in the government are to be introduced. In other words, Madison employs his traditional strategy you're probably already picking up from what we've done in previous Federalist papers, that Madison's approach to argument is to break the question or the challenge down into parts and deal with each part separately. But what we need to be aware of is that in the process of doing that, Madison oftentimes is able to change the focus a little bit. In other words, by reinterpreting the criticism, he's shifting it into something that he can respond to. It's shrewd. It requires incredible intelligence. And obviously, the reason that Madison feels in the Federalist Papers that he's able to do this is because he's quite comfortable with the fact, I think, that the vast majority of people are not going to pick this up. They're not going to read well enough or care enough to pick up these nuances. Madison's operating at a law school level here. If you think about it, this is legalisms. This is legal stuff. And the vast majority of us, if you've bought anything and entered into a contract with a cell phone or a television on time payments or anything else, or a credit card, you know what the small print looks like. You know the way the attorneys write it up in such a way that somehow, if things don't go the way they're planned, the way they're supposed to go, you're going to be in trouble. You can't figure out how. You just know that if any problem arises, it's going to be your fault. We know that. So this is what Madison is doing. He's laying it out into parts. He takes the first issue, which is the real character of the government, whether in fact it is a consolidated government, he's saying. And then he breaks that down into a number of parts. He said the way we need to deal with this is to consider it in relation to the foundation on which it's to be established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of those powers, to the extent of those powers, and to the authority by which future changes in government are to be introduced. Now he goes into the first relation, it appears. He says, on the one hand, that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America. I want you to listen to this. And if you can understand this and make sense of this, then I would suggest you rank among the few. I think this is absolutely unbelievable. So bear with me. He says the first relation, it appears, that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America, given by deputies elected for the special purpose. But on the other hand, that this assent and ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states, derived from the supreme authority in each state, the authority of the people themselves. The act, therefore, establishing the Constitution of the United States will not be a national, but a federal act. I hope you are able to appreciate the logic of that argument. What Madison is saying, remember he says the first order of business here in determining the character of the government, whether in fact it's consolidated or not, whether it's national or whether it maintains the spirit of federalism that we had under the Articles of Confederation. The first issue to be concerned with is the foundation on which it's established. In other words, where does government's power come from? And so what Madison says is, it's coming by the assent and ratification to be given by the people, but not as individuals composing a nation, but as individuals composing distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states derived from the supreme authority of each state, the authority of the people themselves. In other words, he's looking at direct and indirect consent here. He's saying basically the people of each state created that state's constitution. They were sovereign. The people were sovereign. Now, the very same people of these states have chosen to create a government over all the states. But it's not being created by the approval of the people of the United States. It's being created by the people of each state separately and independently. And they are the supreme power because they're the ones that had the power to create the state government in the first place. Therefore, Madison says, this government is not national, it's federal, because it's created by the states, but not the state legislatures, not the power structure in the states, by the people of the states who are the sovereign power who created the states under the state constitution. I hope I've been able to explain that, because it's hard to explain. It's really heavy logic. I would suggest to you that after going through this, reading the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and Immanuel Kant and all that stuff would be easy. Once you're dealing with logic like this, tell me that James Madison is not brilliant. Tell me the logic and the analysis here politically is not brilliant. Tell me that what Madison is doing here is creating the basis for Lincoln's position at the time of the Civil War to claim that the Confederate States of America were in rebellion against the legitimate union of the United States created by the sovereign people of each state. What Madison is doing here is incredibly important politically and philosophically and legally. Because if, this is what if history, if what Madison is saying here was not true, if the Constitution of the United States was ratified by the people of the nation, then it would be a majority-minority thing. But by insisting on the ratification by states, what you have done is gone back to the original source of sovereignty at the time of independence. What John Locke claimed was going back to something resembling the state of nature. What the Declaration of Independence said was the people's right to abolish the contract, the social contract, abolish government and create a new government. But notice, the people don't go all the way back to the state of nature before there was an organized society. Once you organize society, it remains organized. So what Madison is doing here is incredibly clever. Consequently, he is able to claim that the results of this in establishing the Constitution are not national, but federal. Now, here's his explanation for that reasoning. I'm just going to read it without commentary. That it will be a federal and not a national act, Madison says, as these terms are understood by the objectors. The act of the people as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from this single consideration, that it is to result neither from the decision of a majority of the people of the Union, nor from that of a majority of the states. It must result from the unanimous consent of the several states that are parties to it, differing not otherwise from their ordinary assent than in its being expressed, not by the legislative authority, but by that of the people themselves. I defy you to explain in your own words what that means. Madison is playing rhetorical games here. But he's established the principle, and now he's rationalized it. He's justified it. He's defending it. The key is that the Union is not created by the state legislatures, because if it was, then the southern states would have been within their legitimate rights to secede from the Union. But by going to special conventions of the people in each state, which is the way the Constitution was ratified, what Madison has done is gone back to the original source of power, which is the consent of the governed. That's the same source of power that created the state constitutions in the first place. And now, in their infinite wisdom, these people have decided that in addition to the state governments they created, it's necessary to have a national government over them. But it's not a majority-minority rule thing. It's the unanimous assent of the several states that are parties to it. You don't have to count the states that are not party to it, only the ones that are in there. It has to be unanimous. And what Madison has done here is cover all of his bases. And the logic is incredible. Madison says, were the people regarded in this transaction as forming one nation, the will of the majority of the whole people of the United States would bind the minority, in the same manner as the majority in each state must bind the minority. And the will of the majority must be determined either by a comparison of the individual votes, or by considering the will of the majority of the states as evidence of the will of a majority of the people of the United States. This is the sentence I've marked off on my paper copy, and I have said, wow, because listen to this one. Madison says, neither of these rules have been adopted. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. Because the Constitution is created by each state independently, it's a federal Constitution, not a national one. And of course, to Madison, that means that the allegations of Patrick Henry and others that this Constitution changes the Union and creates a consolidated government by consolidating all the states under it, Madison's saying that's not quite true. And so what he's doing is blunting the criticism of the anti-federalists on a level of reasoning and analysis that most people in the United States would not only be incapable of following, but actually wouldn't care enough to follow. Most people have lives to live. They don't have time to play around with this kind of stuff. This is legal mumbo jumbo. This is the kind of stuff you debate over several beers. These are the kinds of conversations that happen in residential universities and graduate school, where PhD candidates sit around with pitcher after pitcher of beer and discuss the nature of being until daylight the next day. It's a wonderful experience, but obviously most people can't or don't have the time or the energy to buy into it. So Madison has taken that and put it to rest. He feels like he has successfully addressed that issue by saying, since the Constitution was ratified by each state independently, but more specifically by the people of each state independently, not the state legislature, therefore, those who claim that the Constitution is a national constitution are not telling the truth. They are inaccurate. Then Madison goes to the next issue. The next is, he says, the sources which the ordinary powers of government are to be derived. And then he says the House of Representatives derives its powers from the people because the people directly elect it. So far, the government is national, not federal, he says. Listen, this is the logic here. This is unbelievable. Madison says the House of Representatives gets its authority directly from the people who vote for the members of the House of Representatives. So far, the government is national, not federal. In other words, that makes it national. The people elected the House of Representatives. But now he's going to the Senate. The Senate, on the other hand, he says, will derive its powers from the states as political and co-equal societies. And these will be represented on the principle of equality in the Senate as they are now in the existing Congress. So far, the government's federal, not national. Before, he said, with the House of Representatives, it's national, not federal. Now he's saying, because of the way the Senate is chosen, it's federal, not national. Now he gets to the president. And he says the executive power will be derived from a very compound source. The immediate election of the president is to be made by the states in their political characters, the Electoral College. The votes allowed to them are in a compound ratio, which considers them partly as distinct and co-equal societies, partly as unequal members of the same society. The eventual election, again, is to be made by that branch of the legislature which consists of the national representatives. But in this particular act, they are to be thrown into the form of individual delegations from so many distinct and co-equal bodies politic. From this aspect of the government, it appears to be a mixed character, presenting at least as many federal as national features. The difference between a federal and a national government, Madison says, as it relates to the operation of the government, is supposed to consist in this. And then he goes on with this kind of logic. And what he's basically doing is saying, in certain areas it's national, in certain areas it's federal, and then this is his conclusion to Federalist number 39. Last paragraph. The proposed Constitution, therefore, even when tested by the rules laid down by its antagonist, is, in strictness, neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. In its foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it's partly national, partly federal, and partly national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it's federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal nor wholly national. The end. Publius. Now, do you understand what Patrick Henry meant? I'm going back into my I should have had a marker in this, and I apologize. One moment. Okay, here it is. Yesterday, when we looked at Patrick Henry's speech to the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788, Patrick Henry was sarcastically critical when he made reference to the fact that in some ways it's critical, in some ways it's federal, in some ways it's national. He said, Patrick Henry said, "What can avail your specious imaginary balances, your rope dancing, chain rattling, ridiculous ideal checks and contrivances?" And then Patrick Henry says, "Go to the poor man, ask him what he does. He will inform you that he enjoys the fruits of his labor under his own fig tree with his wife and children around him in peace and security." In other words, the people don't care about this stuff. You are creating a straw man, Patrick Henry is saying. You're creating dangers that aren't even there in order to browbeat and frighten people into endorsing this system. You say basically in some places it's federal, in some places it's national. You're dancing around. What Patrick Henry is sarcastically saying is, this is a pile of crap, and you know it. And the irony is, if you think about it, at least in terms of this, it is. What Madison has been forced to do is go to the extremes in order to refute the major criticisms of the Constitution of the United States, that it's not Republican and that it destroys the structure of government, the Confederation of sovereign states, and replaces it with a consolidated national government which brings all the states together under it. As long as that becomes the focus and remains the focus of the anti-federalist attack, then it's a hard one for the Federalists to counter. Madison believed that he had to undercut those allegations, those charges, because nobody could refute them. Because the fact of the matter is, Patrick Henry's right. But Madison cannot admit that. Because if he does, the Constitution is not ratified. In Virginia, for example, the majority of the convention elected in June in Virginia is made up of anti-federalists. At the end of the day, Madison is going to have to commit to a Bill of Rights in order to get this group to go along. Because they were elected by the people of Virginia to vote no, as was New York, which comes later. And so consequently, Madison has to refute these. And so what he does is he throws his opponents into an intellectual tizzy. And he causes them to fumble around and try to counter his counter, and that blunts the whole case. The point I'm trying to make is the average citizen in the country at this time is not involved in this argument, can't understand it, probably could care less about these little details. But what they do care about are the major details. And the major details are, in order to preserve individual liberty, you've got to have Republican government, and these people have changed it. These people claim that they're giving us a Republican government, but in reality, they are taking away our freedom by creating a national government with power over us, and they're asking us to approve it. We can't do that, says Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee and the other leaders of the opposition. And eventually, the opposition coalesces around the lack of a Bill of Rights. At that point, Madison has to cave on that, recognizing that if we don't approve a Bill of Rights, we're not going to get the Constitution approved. I think that this Federalist 39 Federalist paper is one of the most important papers of all of them. But because it's so difficult to understand, because it's written and argued on such an intellectual level, and I'm talking, and you're probably saying, how does he know all this stuff? I've spent 40 years looking at this stuff. I don't think this way either. But I've been, because of what I do and because of the area I chose to go into, this basically has become the focus of my professional life. It's trying to understand and figure this stuff out. My purpose here at the Virtual Center is to kind of share what I think I found with you, because I think it's important. I think what we've got to realize, however, is that to Madison and to the Federalists generally, the ends justify the means. You do whatever you need to do in order to get this approved, because they really believe that if this Constitution is not ratified, the nation, as an independent nation, will be doomed. If that's what drives you, then whatever you need to do to make sure that doesn't happen becomes okay. Philosophically and ethically, I may have problems with that. But politically, it makes some sense. It really does. I really hope, that I've been able to do justice with this particular Federalist paper to James Madison and to the framers. I don't want people to get the wrong idea here. I believe that what we've done today here at the Virtual Center with Federalist number 39 is a couple of things. We've pretty well made the case as to how important these people believe this Constitution was to the future of the nation. That they were willing to go to these ends to get it approved. I think what we've also done is gain some insight into the sophisticated level at which these people thought and understood and reasoned. They were well-read. They were well-educated. James Madison spent 5 years at Princeton University. 3 years pursuing his bachelor's degree, and more than an additional year and a half pursuing postgraduate studies with people that he really respected. Madison's education was at an incredibly high level. But obviously, if you read and think about Patrick Henry's speech, so also were many of the anti-federalists. When I was researching my dissertation, which is more years ago than I'd like to acknowledge, I was reading the criticisms of the Constitution from the pen of Luther Martin, a Baltimore attorney. And his criticisms of the Constitution. Luther Martin was a delegate elected to the Constitutional Convention, but he refused to stay and refused to support the document, came back to Maryland and began to attack it. His attacks are substantive and they are poignant. You can't read Luther Martin's articles in the Maryland newspapers without appreciating the depth of analysis that he's engaging in. He's thinking at a level well above many of the Federalists who oppose him. Ultimately, what sinks Luther Martin is the fact that he's an alcoholic. And the Federalists make an issue of that. They attack him for his character. They attack him for being an alcoholic. They literally destroy him as a person in order to make sure that people don't listen to him as a legalist, as a theorist, as a critic of the Constitution. They can't refute what he says, so they've got to refute him so people will not take seriously what he says. That was my research. That was my exposure to the Anti-Federalists. Luther Martin was my exposure to the sophisticated level at which the debates over this Constitution are being conducted by a relatively few people. The vast majority of citizens are not involved in this at all. Many of them couldn't understand it. Many of them wouldn't care. So you have the PR campaign on the one hand, and then you have the intellectual back and forth between proponents and opponents of the Constitution on the other. It's fascinating and it's important. But I think what it does is it speaks to the level of sophistication at which these people functioned, all of them. I don't think it demeans the character or the reputations of the framers at all. When I read Federalist number 39, I come away with a greater appreciation of James Madison than I had going into it. I think it speaks to its ability, and all I can think of is, what did we do as a people to deserve the quality of leadership that we're seeing here in the 18th century? To read these documents and to try to get into the mind of the people who write them is not to demean them, but to praise them and to recognize them for the quality of their minds and the quality of their commitment and the quality of their patriotism. Obviously, I don't believe, I guess first and foremost, more than anything else, my entire life has been an education. I don't expect students to be able to engage these issues at this level. But I think what we've got to do is take seriously the framers, the founders, what they were about, what they tried to do and how they tried to do it. Our students can understand that and they can appreciate it. They don't have to engage in the line-by-line analysis that we've been going through here. But on the other hand, to continue to give them pablum and to try to convince our young people of things that are not true, because most of us are incapable of understanding what is true, is deplorable. I don't think this is a disservice to the founding. I don't think this is a disservice to the nation. I think, in my case, I come out of this with much more greater level of respect and admiration for the people on both sides of this debate. But I believe very firmly in the principles of Republican government. I think the shift in substance that Madison engages in here is an important one. Where I tend to part from Madison and some of the other founders is that I believe the spirit of the founding and the spirit of republicanism demands that we educate our citizens at a level at which they can begin to appreciate the founding of their own republic, and they can begin to function as citizens in this republic by taking intelligent positions on issues and understanding what's going on, and break once and for all the dependency on the political rhetoric of screamers and demagogues who have no depth. They have a microphone, they have an audience, and they have money. And they scream, and they proclaim, and they criticize, and they demean, but they do not explain, they do not understand. They are engaged in what I believe is the most duplicitous political activities that man can participate in against the best interests of his fellow man. I believe we've got a lot of challenge ahead of us. But I believe that this is the beginning, and this is an important start, and that's why I'm so proud and so thankful for the Virtual Center and for the Head On Radio Network that gives us the kind of airtime to make this kind of an analysis possible. The fact that these analytical programs are being archived and are available on YouTube, thanks to Horst in the Far East on YouTube, and are archived with White Rose Society, means that they are there, hopefully, for people in the future to have access to and react to and hopefully learn a little bit from. I won't be around to appreciate it and to benefit from it, but I do hope that they are meaningful to you. And I thank you for your time and your willingness to devote valuable time to what I believe is this important civic responsibility of all of us. And I thank you. We're at the end of our program today. It's 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow. We'll start at our regular time tomorrow, which will be 1 p.m. in the East, and we'll begin to look at Federalist number 40, which is the continuation of this particular Federalist paper. I think it is equally important. I hope you will enjoy it. I'll do the best I can on that score. Thank you.